David is the professor and the head of the Department of Global Development Studies at Queen's University in Canada, and has been running this really interesting project called the Municipal Services Project, which I put just a little printout of their website, some of the books that they've done on the table. Because you see that it's a wide range of projects, and from what I gather, the first phase of their research was really looking at critiquing privatization, neoliberal trends, and now has shifted to really thinking about what are alternatives to privatization, and has put out some really fantastic publications that, he's got a couple extra copies of. But I think this is a real big question about all of the big buzz about public-private partnerships, and which is more efficient? And we are really excited to hear what you have to say, so welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Maybe we can actually pass those around. People can have a quick look at them. And I do have a few. Routledge, they're kind of the mafia now of publishing. They Taylor and Francis owns almost everything. Came out at a hardcover at $100 and something. I managed to get them to give us some paperbacks, and so I've got, if you want, they're $20 each at cost. And these are $5 each. You can also download them for free on our website. So anyways, if you want.
That's going to be hotcakes. Can I get my copy right now?
It's booked. There you go, one left. So as Shamila said, this Municipal Services Project, which I've been running since 2001, we spent the first 7 or 8 years critiquing privatization. And I use that in the broad sense of the term. I'll talk a bit about corporatization as a kind of commercialization of the public sector in a minute. But obviously public-private partnerships and other forms of marketizing services. Mostly in South and Southern Africa. John Briscoe, I believe, is originally from South Africa, and was certainly a kind of reference point for many of us at the World Bank as he pushed the South African government towards privatizing, commercializing their water services. So I'm sure he'd have some things to say about this. But after many, many years of critiquing, we said, okay, we know what we don't want. What do we want? What are the alternatives to privatization, again, defined broadly, that we think we want to promote? And that's not to say that the debate about public and private is over. There's still some very useful debates, and I think the private sector has performed very well in some cases. But I think there are some structural reasons that the privatization of basic services, water, electricity, healthcare, sanitation, etc., is fundamentally flawed. And so we're looking to say, okay, well, if it's fundamentally flawed, what are some of the alternatives to this? And I think the other thing that's happened is the debate has kind of stalemated. It's turned into a bun fight where people are shouting at each other and not really listening. And those of us who have been critiquing, frankly, haven't been putting out particularly well-argued and particularly rigorous kinds of arguments about alternatives. And so this big book, we call it The Brick, is intended to do that. It's intended to try and lay out some conceptual and methodological foundations for what we mean by alternatives to privatization, and then informed by quite a substantial amount of empirical research, which we've then been following up with additional work. This rather slim-looking volume, which is actually a lot more interesting than the slimness would suggest, is a series of case studies of cities around the world which have remunicipalized their water. So we look at Paris, France, Hamilton in Canada, Buenos Aires, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and a collection of municipalities in Malaysia. And talk about how they've remunicipalized and made water public again, and why that's worked, and what some of the challenges have been. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the other work we're doing. But we're trying to now populate this work with more empirical case study, sort of boring deeper, if you will, into these questions. So I'll talk for half an hour or so, and then open it up for discussion, comments, and certainly critique. Because if we're going to critique the privatizers, we have to be able to critique ourselves. And I was saying to Shamila earlier, I'm in the odd situation now of my colleagues, sometimes my allies, sometimes getting annoyed at me because we start critiquing ourselves and saying things about ourselves that they don't really like to hear. But I think we need to be prepared to, point out when things are not particularly rigorous or particularly helpful. So that's part of what we're trying to do here with this work. So, So two main things. First of all, what is public? And then secondly, how do you go out and evaluate these things once you've tried to identify it? So we decided to take a fairly straightforward approach in defining it, and one is a negative approach, which is to eliminate the private. So any private, for-profit service delivery company is excluded from our definition of public. That may seem obvious on the face of it, but the UN runs a number of agencies which include private companies in public as a public agency. So you may be familiar with these public-public partnerships, PUPs, and there's a UN body which is coordinating PUPs, and sitting on their steering committee are a bunch of private companies. How you have a private for-profit company sitting on a public agency board is odd to me, but so I think it's important to, first of all, for us to say that when we talk about public agencies, we exclude for-profit private companies. On the positive side, we include state agencies at various scales, municipal, regional, provincial, federal, and also non-state agencies that are operating on a non-profit basis. So that includes NGOs, it includes community organizations. We're actually doing work right now on faith-based health providers in East Africa and India. So it gets pretty fuzzy when you start to talk about these things because they are private agencies in some respects, and particularly with religious bodies. This one in India is a Christian-based health provider, and they provide Christian health in a Hindu country. And you think, well, how is this public or is it private? But it's not for profit, and it's a non-state agency, so we're interested in trying to explore these kind of gray zones of publicness. And we're, of course, looking at partnerships, so different public agencies working together and public and non-state, state and non-state agencies working together. So it's a fairly broad sense of what public is, but it rules out any for-profit kind of organization. The one that gets a little tricky is this corporatization. For those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it's used to refer to, and we're doing a book on this right now, which we hope to have out early next year, looks at state-run and state-operated services, so totally public in their ownership and management, but ring-fenced and placed at an arm's length from official government agencies to be run as a utility. So public utility commissions in the States and Canada are common examples of that. So the management of a water entity, for example, is run separately, and it's done in part to financially ring fence that entity, so the state knows whether that water company is making or losing money. Electricity companies are often run this way as well, so we're looking at water and electricity corporate entities. And we had sort of written them off as essentially commercialized entities, partly with our experience in South Africa with the biggest electricity provider in Africa, Eskom, and a couple of the big water utilities, Rand Water and Umgeni Water, which are publicly owned and publicly operated, but operate not only like private companies, but even more aggressively than private companies, in part because they get away with being public. And Eskom and Umgeni and Rand were cutting off people's water and electricity literally by the hundreds of thousands. We estimated from about late 90s to about early 2000s that as many as 10 million people had been affected by water and electricity cutoffs by public agencies who were interested primarily in full cost recovery and were putting in prepaid meters and water restrictors and so on. So hyper commercialized approaches that private companies frankly would never even try because they know that they would just be protested out of town, which has happened in places like Cochabamba and so on. So we thought, well, these aren't public agencies. But then some of my colleagues started to say, well, hold on, there's been some good experiences with corporatization. So we're doing work right now in Uruguay, for example, with the OCE, the national water provider, which is corporatized and has a very strong public ethos. And we're also the ICI in Costa Rica, the electricity provider. There's some interesting groups in Burkina Faso, in Tunisia, the electricity provider in Malaysia. So we're trying to get a handle on, how do you, what do you make of this new public management model that's being introduced to public agencies? as kind of corporatized entities. So we've included them, maintained them in this definition of public, but we're also saying, okay, that's public, but how well do they operate? And that takes me to the next aspect of what we're looking at here, which is the question of how you evaluate these things. Because it's one thing to say an agency is public, it's another thing to say whether or not you think it's good public. And there's no point in my mind in defending bad public services, whether they be corrupt, whether they be inefficient, whether they be poorly managed, whatever the case may be. Blindly celebrating publicness for the sake of publicness is not very useful. And after all, throughout history, there have been some very problematic public agencies. I mean, Hitler ran Germany largely through public agencies. Very efficient, not particularly equitable or fair. So there's been lots of cases of really well-run and efficient, get back to that question of efficiency, public agencies, but on other criteria have been dismal failures. So we said, okay, how are we going to evaluate? What kinds of criteria, beyond some fuzzy, warm, and good feeling about publicness, do we want to apply to understanding criteria for success? So we said, okay, let's come up with a list of things that we think are real enough and objective enough to be able to be measured, without being so strictly defined that leaves no room for variability. So for example, something like participation in decision-making about public services. What might be expected to be an adequate level of participation in one place might be a ridiculously high level of expectation in another place. And so we want to put these criteria out so that they're references and they're markers that can be evaluated without being so strict that if you don't meet a certain criteria, you are therefore not a successful public service provider. So I'll run through these things just to give you a sense of what we mean in concrete terms, keeping in mind that the objective here is not to put together hard and fast rules for what constitutes a successful public agency, but reference points that people can say, yes, we're doing well on that, or we're not doing well on that. And keeping in mind, too, that there is no, as one of my colleagues likes to say, there are no chemically pure public agencies. No public agency is going to be really well run on all of these criteria. And so, to use Hitler's Germany as an example, very efficient, fantastic on efficiency, not very good on equity and those kinds of things. So, you wouldn't call that a successful public agency. And some of these you'll recognize them as the kinds of language that the World Bank uses. And we've intentionally used the same kind of criteria, but tried to slice it in slightly different ways. So I'll start with the notion of efficiency. We have said you cannot have a good public agency if you're not efficient. And in some ways, public agencies, despite what the World Bank and others would like to say, public agencies have been run very, very efficiently. But it's not simply on financial efficiency terms. It's questions of efficiency around the use of renewable resources. It's efficiency in terms of how it plays out around sustainability. It's efficiency in terms of, does it mean that women and men are getting access to the same level of services? And so we cross-cut it with questions of equity, for example. So you can have efficiency, but if you're not providing equitable services to people, geographically, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnic groupings, etc., then that efficiency criteria is not particularly effective. Similarly with participation. If you're not engaging the end users of your services in decision-making, and not necessarily on a day-to-day basis about, do you think we should have the water pressure at this level or that level, but big decisions about infrastructure investments, etc. If you're not engaging citizens in those kinds of things, then you're not doing a good job with publicness. And you may be familiar with some of the Brazilian models of participatory budgeting, where literally tens of thousands of people participate in decision-making about municipal investments. We're also looking at questions of quality of service. What is the level of water delivery? Is the water good? Is the customer service good, etc.? Accountability is another one. Can you go and actually challenge the municipal authority in terms of what their kind of service that they're delivering to you? So are they accountable in the way that the kinds of service they provide? Are they transparent? Can you get the information that you want to find out about their service delivery? Another one that we think a lot about is quality of the workplace. And in the water and sanitation sector, I don't know if you've ever been down in the sewage line, or one of the most disgusting days I ever spent in my life was collecting buckets of feces in informal settlements in Cape Town, where the municipal government had thought that they were doing some good environmental things by providing bucket systems where there wasn't running flush sanitation. And then workers would go out and collect a couple hundred of these buckets a day and bring them to a transfer station and dump them into a sluice where it would go for water treatment. And these guys were working with almost no protective equipment, and you can just imagine the kinds of disease vectors and so on. And with waste management, electricity, health and safety of the workforce is absolutely essential. And pro-privatizers spend a lot of time thinking about efficiency, how you get the number of workers per connections down, how you reduce the cost of the labor force. And yet these are the frontline people who are often put at risk. So if you don't have a safe and enjoyable workplace, is that a quality public service? And so we work a lot with public sector unions and a lot with frontline workers to talk about what is the quality of the workplace. And to be honest, it's been a bit shocking, even in Latin America, where some of the most progressive and interesting things are happening on public services, in even so-called socialist states, how little attention is paid to the work and health and safety in the workplace. Sustainability, obviously a critical question. And I don't just mean financial sustainability or environmental sustainability, but how sustainable is something politically? So if you get tens of thousands of people participating in decisions about a budget, can you sustain that for years and years and years? And in Brazil, they've done a pretty darn good job with this participatory budgeting model. But there's been problems. It's starting to fade out. And let's face it, I mean, we have a lot of things to do in our lives. Do we want to be going to community meetings once a week or once a day or once a month? And how long can you sustain that kind of participatory modeling? So I think we need to ask questions about the sustainability of these things. Then the last two criteria we throw out, which are a little harder to try and measure, a little more ephemeral, are questions of solidarity and public ethos. And one of the problems, I think, with corporatization is that it sets up a kind of standalone, ring-fenced, almost ivory tower kind of service. And when we do interviews with managers of these kinds of entities, they're not thinking about what the electricity people are doing, or what the public health people are doing, or what the stormwater sewage drainage people are doing. It creates a kind of bubble of thinking. And we've lost that in the public sector. Whatever one thought of old welfare states and Keynesianism, there was a lot of discussion going on, cross-fertilization, sharing of budgets, sharing of equipment. Now it's this kind of, that's my truck, and if you're going to use it, you have to pay me. That's my photocopier. Those are my personnel. And there's been this remarkable disjuncture of thinking and siloization of urban planning around service delivery. And so this notion of what kinds of solidarity is there going between services, between levels of government, and indeed across borders, right? And particularly, water is a very local service, largely. But healthcare, electricity, and other services have a very regional dimension. And, particularly in the South, a lot of these borders are old colonial constructs that make very little sense. And so, to what extent are service providers thinking about solidarity, thinking about reaching out and working across boundaries? And there's been some very interesting stuff in the water sector with public-public partnerships, and the Brazilians in particular have been working in other countries to help them build their public sector. So I think, to be a good public service, it's important to be thinking about questions of solidarity and working with other public service providers. And then finally, this notion of a public ethos, possibly the hardest thing to try and get our heads around. But it's amazing when you talk to, particularly again, these corporatized service entities. New public management and the ideology of neoliberalism has pervaded the public sector to such a point where people don't think in these terms anymore. They really are driven by what is the financial bottom line. And to think about, hey, are we building a sense of community with our service? Are we somehow contributing to a better public life for people? That kind of ideology of a public ethos has been eroded. But it's there, and it's in some of the better public services we've looked at, people talk about these kinds of things. And so what we're saying is that we need to think about and try and rebuild a sense of public ethos in our public services. So this book talks about this kind of theory and methodology, and then it looks at some of the main actors in this area. And I'd mentioned the fact that we're working a lot with unions, and there's a chapter in there on public sector unions and their engagement with thinking about public versus private services. There's a chapter on social movements, a lot of which have a kind of anarchist bent to them and just want the state out. When I worked with Red Vida, the Latin American Water Network, who sits on our steering committee, I remember going to Cochabamba to see when they first wanted to join our project, and as soon as I mentioned the word state, about a third of the room got up and left. Literally, they just said, this guy's a statist, we're out of here. So a lot of movements are fed up with the state, and they just see the state as corrupt and interested in elite service delivery. So trying to engage with these very dynamic grassroots movements is very interesting, and how they work together. So grassroots community groups and labor groups, etc., working together has been quite interesting. And then we look at three services: water, electricity, and primary health care in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And it's a kind of the big book is a kind of bird's eye view of some of the very interesting things that are going on out there in the world. And we've used this book to kind of launch some of the more specific things. So when we've identified remunicipalization as a new trend, and when I say trend, I mean there are something like 300 municipalities in Europe where private water contracts are due for renewal over the next couple of years. And the Germans in particular are gearing up to remunicipalize in a big way. And the fact that Paris remunicipalized with Suez and Veolia in their own backyard has been a big political kind of added some real weight to that movement. So I think we're going to see remunicipalization happening in a major way over the next 2 to 10 years. So it's so there's a lot of things happening out there, and I think there's a really vibrant debate about what are the alternatives to privatization. People are finally just getting to this point where, okay, we're done shouting at and yelling at the World Bank and the pro-privatizers. It's time for us to go out there and try and make things happen. And it's not me or us as academics trying to push these things. As academia works, we are always 5 years behind the ball. But identifying things and trying to understand how they work, and then sharing that with labor unions, with social movements, with policymakers, to try and say, here's where the trends are, and here's what's going on with regards to trends around the world. And I think the water sector is by far the most advanced. The most interesting debates are happening. The most collaboration is going on. I was at the Alternative World Water Forum in Marseille in March. As you may know, the UN coordinates a World Water Forum, an official one. Was anyone there by any chance? Okay, it's basically just a corporate show. It's shocking. You walk in to the big convention center in Marseille, and it's all the big engineering companies, all the big private water companies with women walking around with trays of champagne. And I mean, it's just literally, that's what it's about. And this was the fourth or fifth World Water Forum, and activists finally said, no, this is enough. We're not just going to protest these people, we're going to actually have a parallel alternative World Water Forum. And so we had one on the other end of town in the docks part of Marseille, about 4,000 people in attendance, and it was just absolutely dynamic. People from all over the world talking about alternatives to privatization. So the water sector is, I think, at the cutting edge of this, and it's at the cutting edge also in terms of cross-border collaboration. So the Latin Americans are talking to the Africans who are talking to the Europeans, etc. The electricity sector is probably the least organized and the least advanced. And I think that's in part because electricity is seen to be a much more complicated, capital-intensive kind of thing. You know, almost anybody can make clean water. It's not that difficult. Electricity, if you're going to do it on a large scale, involves a lot more technology and investment. So the electricity sector is a lot further behind in this regard. And I think the health sector is somewhere in between. And there's a little more collaboration going on, and some very interesting things going on in the health sector around making those services public again and clawing back everything from national health insurance schemes to new technologies to grassroots health interventions, etc., at the public level. And then I'll just close by saying that we're also very interested in questions of gender. And Chandra Mohanty, some of you may know, feminist scholar at Syracuse, we've been working closely with to try and think about, well, how do we think about public from a gender point of view? And there's some very real questions around access to services, obviously, and there's very good documentation that privatization of water in particular has made it more difficult for women to access water, that women bear the burden of raising prices, etc. But what does it mean when we start to think about public services? And so we're doing some work right now in Bangladesh in a community where women have been fighting for the right, not only the right to water, but the right to public water. And to what extent do women and men think differently about notions of publicness, and how do they articulate that in their struggle to get public water? So I'll leave it at that and open up for discussion.
Yeah, I'm sure folks have questions. Maybe I'll open up with a couple of
Sure.
questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience to ask a few more. So I've got two different questions. So the first goes to this idea of corporatized public entities. And I know that if you think about part of the push for why a lot of entities in the public sector have corporatized is in part because when you have water services that are part of a broader municipality, they're more susceptible to political interference, often to corruption, to concerns about that if funding coming in and out can get dispersed. And that isn't it really not a question of corporatization, but are there, from the standpoint of transparency and accountability, if it is at least within the public sector, are there more avenues for accountability and transparency and perhaps kind of a sort of due process for individual consumers when it's still with part of the public sphere, as opposed to a more attenuated concession type arrangement? So that's my, take that question first, and maybe I'll ask my second one later on.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're right, and my own experience and my close colleague in South Africa was that the South African experience with corporatization was so negative that we'd kind of written it off. And I would say the same thing applies to many of the African countries that we looked at. The Latin American experience is different. And I should say, we're primarily interested in Africa, Asia, and Latin America with our work. in part because those agencies were corporatized in a different era. They were corporatized in the 30s and 40s and 50s under a kind of Keynesian regime, and have maintained a sense of public ethos and solidarity and commitments to equity and so on that I think units that have been corporatized more recently under the rubric of neoliberalism have never had from the beginning. And so I think you're right that there are some advantages to removing the service providers from the kind of dirt of day-to-day politics. There are places where politicians will try and use infrastructure investments to get votes, right? And so I think there's some very strong arguments to be made that these things need to be done in technocratic ways and fair ways and somewhat depoliticized ways. But I think the problem is that neoliberal ideology has become so ingrained. And those of you in public policy programs here can maybe speak to this. We have a public policy program at my university as well. And I'll speak to my university. There's a 6-week seminar going on right now about how you make the public service more efficient by introducing business criteria, right? And it's things like you pay managers incentives based on the profitability of the utility. You introduce all kinds of market-oriented management techniques that I think just fundamentally distort what it is that people do and think about on a day-to-day basis. And so if you're thinking, okay, at the end of the year, my evaluation and my pay package is going to depend on what the bottom line was, versus my performance is going to be evaluated based on how many women got access to this service and whether or not I collaborated with the public health agencies and so on. There's a very different kind of framework and operational philosophy there. And it's taken 30 years for neoliberalism, I think, to penetrate the public sector to the depth that it has. So it's going to take a long time to challenge that kind of operational philosophy.
But is that so much about introducing criteria as the kind of criteria you're introducing?
Yes.
Because if you had metrics that actually where your metric was not just number of household, and so it's easier to provide access to households in affluent areas as opposed to informal settlements. So is that really attention?
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree, and that's why we're using criteria that are not that much different, right? When we're talking about efficiency, we're talking about accountability and transparency. But the kinds of criteria that are used are things like, and this is one that the World Bank loves to use, how many workers per water connection, right? That's a really important thing for them. And so the incentive there is to minimize your workforce per water connection. And that's not to say that that's not necessarily a bad objective, right? I mean, you want to use your resources as efficiently as possible. But what tends to happen is that you get the workforce down at the cost of health and safety, at the cost of longer-term maintenance, etc. So I think you're exactly right. It's the kind of criteria that are applied, but I think the kind of the criteria that are applied are a product of the kind of neoliberal ideology that informs what is successful or not.
Who else has questions? Yeah, please.
I have one question. I come from Lebanon, which is the country is basically managed as a private company. So
is it public though?
I don't know.
You mean the country is managed?
The country, yeah.
The entire country, okay, yeah.
So for example, I was there last summer, and in Beirut, which is like the capital, there are parts of it who had 3 hours of electricity per day.
Mm.
So my position is for demunicipalization actually because of this. So I was wondering if you had
D or remunicipalization?
D, because okay. I want to isolate the services from the government, because I think people would benefit much more if the services were not related to the government. And I was wondering if I feel that remunicipalization is something that's very dependent on the country's political structure. Mm-hmm. So if you have a structure of big corruption, heavy corruption, what would be your position vis-a-vis if you have any case?
Yeah, and I think that the kinds of transformations we're talking about are generational transformations as well in some respects. That you're not going to rid a municipality or a province or a country of corruption overnight by any means. And perhaps some kinds of arm's lengthing, corporatization in that regard might be a way to do it. If it has the kinds of, it's given the kinds of criteria around equity and accountability and so on that are operating in the public interest. So if we know that, or if we want to argue that in general privatization tends to make services more difficult to access and more expensive for the poor, then what kinds of criteria do you want to put in place so that doesn't happen? While you still maintain it publicly. So, one of the powerful arguments that private companies have is that they can come in and do these things overnight, right? And to some extent, that's true. They can come in and shake things up very quickly. But then it, inevitably creeps towards this inequality that we see. So I think it's, governments and residents of a nation need to be able to say, we need to have a kind of medium to long-term perspective on this, and what kinds of policies and restructuring do you want to put in place, which, it's not going to happen 2 years from now or 5 years from now, but, maybe 10 years from now we'll sort of be getting to where we need to be at. And looking at what other countries have done in this regard actually can be quite useful. Some of the lessons that have been learned elsewhere in trying to restructure, because Lebanon certainly is not alone in that regard.
Do other folks have questions? Okay, well, maybe people are thinking, I'll ask another one, which is that, so I thought it was interesting, this pushback of, how you're defining public. So public is state and basically community organizations. And so coming from the human rights perspective, one of the challenges is that there's kind of a dichotomy, because there's the state and then there's non-state. And so non-state, you lump together both your private and your community. And in the standpoint of, so within the last couple of years, the idea of the human right to water has been recognized internationally and has gotten a lot of attention. And it's not about state provided services, but there is a role for the state to be responsible for protecting, respecting, and fulfilling those rights. And do you see that as a tension? And for example, are there community managed forms of services that really the state shouldn't have a role in because, for example, they're indigenously managed organizations, or they're basically just much more organically community run?
Yeah, and I think water to some extent lends itself more easily to that. If you've got, reasonable volumes and quality of water that you can literally tap into. I think though in reality what often happens is that states are investing very heavily as the state in middle class, upper income areas, providing, first world, if you will, water quality and sewage provision. And then sort of letting the other stuff happen because, that's good sort of entrepreneurial, local initiative kinds of things. And so, they're out there digging ditches and cleaning pipes and so on. And it kind of becomes a kind of sweat equity that really you don't see in upper middle income areas, right? So I think that it needs to be balanced between what is the responsibility of the state at a larger scale to make sure that everybody has access to an adequate level of water. And I think it too often slips easily into this sense of local initiative and entrepreneurialism that the World Bank likes to celebrate, but it's just third-rate water services. So I think that finding that balance between not bulldozing over local community initiatives, while at the same time recognizing that there are sort of national standards that need to be met, and the state has a responsibility in rural areas and urban areas to make sure that those things are there.
And can you give an example of, I mean, I think what you're hitting on is in some ways the participation question. I know in your writing, it's talked about that everybody uses this idea that there needs to be community participation and that there can be meaningful community participation and there can be something that seems very onerous and time consuming. And can you think of some examples that are actually effective forms of participation that are properly striking that balance? Because what I hear you saying is that sometimes this idea of community-led community ownership is really the state saying, well, great, spend all your time at meetings or run this or organize this for yourselves, and in the more well-to-do areas, we've got piped infrastructure so people don't need to worry about that.
Yeah, or offloading, just getting back to the health and safety questions, right? I mean, people are out there picking up their own garbage and cleaning up their own sewers, and it's often the women, and it's often the most marginalized women that are doing this work, right? So there's a question of, is it just an offloading of costs? But I think there's some really interesting stuff in the health sector, and someone I've just been in communication with recently in a couple of provinces in India where there's been some really interesting grassroots kinds of health initiatives to make public health care providers more accountable. And the onus is rather than being put on residents, the onus is put on these public health providers to make sure that what they're providing is what people want. And so people have a better opportunity to come and voice their opinions. And it's all about making the public provider accountable. And so I think that's the way it needs to be done, rather than sort of dumping the responsibility on local communities who are often the most strapped for time and resources. That the state needs to be more accountable for what they're providing, and that people can step in when and if they think it's necessary to push them to become accountable. So some of these initiatives in primary health care in rural India are really interesting. I think the Brazilian participatory budgeting stuff is interesting as well. And they take it very seriously. So once one round of budgeting is done, they literally start the next day for the next year, right? So it's not left to 3 weeks before the budget decisions are made. And it works itself up from little barrios and working its way up to higher levels of decision making, and it's a 12-month kind of process. So I think the examples are places where resources are put in to make it happen, where the onus is not just dumped on local communities, and ultimately I think where people feel that they're getting a level and a quality of services which isn't just to kind of shut them up and it's a quality that is satisfactory to them. So I don't think there's any single place that exemplifies all of these things, but I think there's more and more of it happening.
Actually, two questions. First is to you is the source of water also a point of contention or concern, especially when it comes to big cities and the idea which you said about the class factor that comes in? And the second question is perhaps to people here, because it's just my third week in this country and I'm trying to understand how's the water system in this country, or if we could narrow it down just to Boston or Massachusetts.
Now, when you say the source of the water, you
Yeah.
mean whether it's public or private, or?
No, just the basic source from the geographic point of view, and in that battling the question of, so if the source of water is here in this part of geography and it's being transported elsewhere, so then how do we talk about the issue of private or public?
Right.
Because often in cases of India, I mean, you've seen that water which is predominantly the source of, like in Bombay, the source of water is about 300 kilometers away, another part. So that's definitely a kind of contentious issue there.
And it runs by a lot of communities who don't get that water.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, water generally is a local commodity. And Karen Bach has written a book, I love the title, The Uncooperative Commodity, because it's a very heavy, bulky thing to move. And so, I wouldn't say Mumbai is unique, but it's unusual in that it's moved so far, although places like California also have these questions. And who has right to this water, who controls the canalization, and so on. But generally speaking, water tends to be more localized, and the debates are more around watershed management, right? So political lines don't often line up with watershed management, and that becomes tricky, as do cross-boundary things around river access, or you look at the Nile or the Ganges when they pass through different places, and who manages these things. So it becomes really tricky. One country might have a great public policy around water, but then not give a damn about what happens downstream. And so I think that one of the next frontiers for this stuff is going to be cross-border public management, and developing a kind of, and this is where I think this notion of solidarity and public ethos comes in, right? And so, how do you, let's say in the context of Southern Africa, where water scarcity is a real issue, how do you manage water? And most of Johannesburg's water now comes in from the Lesotho highlands. And there's a lot of people in Lesotho who just don't have enough access to water. So it's publicly managed in South Africa, but it's kind of stripping it away from people in Lesotho. So this, this kind of scalar sense of water is quite critical, and electricity even more so, because electricity provision, generally large-scale electricity provision, requires big transmission lines that go all over the place. And in Africa, you've got the Democratic Republic of the Congo, some 7% of people have access to electricity. And yet they're talking about building the largest hydroelectricity dam in the world on the Congo River, which will pump electricity down to the mines in South Africa and all the way to Europe and the Middle East. So these high transmission lines flying over people's heads, and they don't have any access to it. So, publicness becomes tricky once you start crossing borders. Boston, I don't know.
Answer that.
Yeah.
There's a reservoir in the middle of the state of Quabbin, and it's pumped through a series of aqueducts and then resold by the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority to certain towns that essentially just act as distribution systems.
So it's public.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's probably a utility, sort of arm's length
exactly.
from, right, and state level. You said Massachusetts or?
Yeah, Water Resources Authority.
But there are, but at the municipal level,
Yeah.
there are utilities.
Right.
Yeah, they don't actually, they just distribute to 60 people technically. They sell that water to the different towns, and then they're the actual physical distributor for those towns.
Question back there, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question. I think it's very similar to the Lebanon case. In third world countries where the state is so inefficient and sometimes make decisions that aren't really accountable to anyone, and makes decisions just to benefit a certain segment of the population, where there isn't huge outcry for private organizations to come in and take ownership, because they're so fed up with the public. How do you suggest that we go about in those kind of situations where there is that, like you gave that example of Latin America where people just run away when you mention the state. So how do we bring about this change to make them realize the importance of public against private, and how to make public organizations more accountable? I think that would be more, a very critical issue in developing countries where, people just don't trust the state.
Yeah. Well, I think, the onus is on people who are supporting public to be critical of the public sector as well. And, in most countries, the subsidies are largely benefiting the middle class for water services. And I think that's a basic fact that needs to be challenged. And so, but then it becomes a tricky question, because if water and investment in water is a vote getter and so on, so I don't think there's any easy solution to it, but I think having a more frank discussions about it, pushing public water providers to be more transparent about their investment strategies, etc., is the way to go. If as we feel that the privatization of water over the last 30 years has generally been a failure, then we need to think about other ways of trying to improve the public sector. And it's, from a methodological point of view, it's almost impossible to say, well, what if we had invested in the public sector as opposed to the private sector? It's hard to do those comparisons because, they don't happen simultaneously, right? But I think there's enough comparative evidence from place to place to show that places that have invested in their public sector that have tried to make them more transparent and accountable have done a much better job in the end in terms of efficiency and equity and so on. And public sector water delivery can be very, very efficient. There's absolutely no, I mean, that's the easy part. The difficult part are questions around equity and solidarity and that kind of thing.
So my next question was going to be, I mean, on this point, what about in instances where you have the public and private working together? I mean, I think in electricity you have like private firms producing electricity at a more in a more efficient manner, and then the state buying that, public organization buying that energy from the private sector and then distributing to the public. So can't you have that kind of hybrid in the water sector as well, where the public sector organizations outsource some activities to the private sector in which they are good at, and then distributing that water more in a more equitable manner and things like that.
Yeah, and, I just say I don't think there's any kind of chemically pure, the perfect model, ideal types for public services. I mean, electricity lends itself more to that kind of unbundling, right? You've got generation, transmission, and distribution. There's some of that in the water sector, but generally it's not a model that's been adopted, part because it's more heavily localized and integrated. But there have been attempts to try and create competition within these so-called natural monopolies. So in Manila, for example, they've had two private providers sort of competing with each other. In Paris, it was two private providers trying to, So there's been attempts to try and introduce those kinds of things. But I think there's enough evidence to suggest that if you invest in a integrated public service with a long-term time horizon, that not only do you get good efficiencies, but you get further ahead on these other things around transparency and equity and accountability and so on. So, these public-private partnerships is just another form of privatization. Yeah. And the private companies, frankly, aren't interested in owning outright private water utilities. It's just too risky, right? They're looking for segments to manage and on shorter and shorter term contracts so that they can get out quickly if the risk is too high, right? So they've more or less abandoned that big scale privatization model and moving more towards where can we zip in and make some quick profits, and maybe maybe you can use that on a short term basis, but I think if you're committed to public services, I think you need to think in a more medium to long term time horizon.
What about full cost recovery? So you mentioned that's kind of been a principle that has been pushed in terms of management, but one of the biggest challenges is really affordability of services. So from the standpoint, is it feasible to actually make the upgrades to all of the infrastructure? I forget what the statistics are, but even in the U.S., the actual pipes underground are degrading tremendously, and there's some ridiculous amount of money that it would actually take to actually make those investments.
Yeah, I don't know the figures for the States, but in my province in Canada, it's somewhere up around $15 billion deficit in water and sanitation infrastructure. Massive number. So, I think there's a few things to that. One is who's being fully cost recovered. And again, to use the example of South Africa, in water and electricity, lower income households are paying more per liter of water and per kilowatt hour of electricity than upper income households. And industry tends to be heavily subsidized. So Alcan, which is a big aluminum producer, gets heavily subsidized electricity prices all over the world. That's done in exchange for job creation, etc. But when you break down the numbers, it's a pretty expensive subsidy. So even if that were more equitable, then fully recosting what? And the only way you can actually think about full cost recovery is if you ring fence a water utility so that you know what those full costs are. Because in the old models where trucks were being shared and office space was being shared and so on, you never really knew exactly what it cost, right? But what they did know was the overall cost of running the municipal government. And so I think it shifts away from, I think full cost recovery puts the onus on the end user. It's kind of like a value-added tax, right? You pay for every unit of something you consume. Whereas I think the more public model is to think more in general taxation. So what kind of municipal taxes are people paying for the suite of services? Or what kind of federal taxes are people paying for a suite of services? And it's not to say that we shouldn't know what it's actually costing to provide water and electricity and so on. I think it's useful information. But to suggest that these are standalone entities is problematic because, how are you ever going to pay for a library that way, right? So there has to be some kind of cross-subsidization going on. And whether that's high-income people cross-subsidizing low-income people or one service subsidizing another service, the kind of ring-fencing cost recovery model makes that difficult. So I think we still need to have that discussion in the mix, but balance it out more with questions of, well, what is it costing us to run a suite of services, and how important is it for us to make sure that everybody gets adequate access to these things?
In terms of cost, as you said, with the help of an example possibly, could you tell us about, is there any example where in a developing nation the biggest problem is about the idea of feeling the need to demand for a public system versus the whole idea of, well, I don't care because I can purchase water. So when you have that kind of a tendency, which is definitely coming in developing nations, which in my idea are the case studies of your book there, that is the tendency where I think it's also in South Africa, Lesotho case also, people who can afford to buy it, they wouldn't give a damn about, what's the cost that they're paying for it. In that kind of scenario, which is very much predominant now, how do you build up that kind of solidarity to try and still pressurize for a public system?
Well, I think the pressure is coming from below. It's coming from the 2.3 billion people or whatever it is who don't have access to sanitation. And
who are being silenced all the time.
Who are being silenced all the time, but less and less so, right? They are demanding access to services. What's not clear is to what extent they're demanding access to public versus private services. And on the one hand, if you don't have access to water or sanitation and the opportunity is there for a large or small private company to come in and provide these things, maybe you go for it. And so, in the sort of politics of desperation, sometimes these things aren't adequately discussed. But there are, I'm always amazed at the level of conversation and the sophistication of conversation with NGOs and social movement groups that are articulating their demands around what they want and, recognize that what privatization has done to access to services. So, particularly places that have gone through these things, like in Bolivia, there's some very vibrant debates going on around public versus private service delivery. So, the disenfranchised are often the most voiceless people, and those who have the voice often have the services and don't necessarily care about it. So it's a kind of a bad situation in that regard.
So is there any kind of successful model where that has where that kind of a problem has been overcome, or there have been attempts?
Yeah.
Or?
Well, I'll give you a very mixed one in Cochabamba in Bolivia, where they kicked out Bechtel, an American private water company that drove prices up very quickly under the previous Bolivian government that was pro-privatization. And people rose up and kicked them out. It was a fairly dramatic series of the water wars, at least one person killed. So they got rid of the private company and then tried to get a public company going, and it hasn't worked very well. In part because people know what they don't like, but it really wasn't clear what they do like and what they want. And this, is coming from people who were very closely involved in this, who are now quite disappointed in what happened and are really just struggling to try and think, okay, how are we going to create a good, efficient, transparent public service? It's a long story about why that hasn't happened, but I think that we're in a period right now where people are resisting successfully privatization, but not always getting what they really want. And even this book with remunicipalization, is very mixed. I think the Paris example has been pretty efficient. They went on January 1st, 2010, from private to public. Most Parisians had no idea. Water just kept coming out of the tap. They just, it went from one to another and nobody really knew. It wasn't like a grassroots movement. It was a political movement by bureaucrats who realized they could save about 30 million euros a year, which they have in fact saved, by doing it publicly in-house. So, that wasn't a grassroots thing. That was a bureaucratic decision, and it's successful, but it hasn't really changed people's minds about public versus private. So, whereas in other cases, in Tanzania, they went from private back to public, and again, it hasn't actually worked all that well, but at least it's back in public hands. So, I think the next, 10 years or so is going to be this kind of experimentation and what works and what lessons are to be learned from different places, and that kind of cross-fertilization of information and ideas will be really critical.
Great. And so one question about, so from the Paris example, it's interesting to me because in some ways I would say it is a success if people didn't notice, but from your standpoint, you seem somewhat regretful that people didn't realize and that you don't have this broader ethos. So for you, in terms of how you rank criteria, is that less of a success?
Yeah, I think if notions of a kind of public ethos are important, and the average Parisian is like, I don't know who runs their water, right? And the French water companies are so powerful. Then what has been achieved, right? And however, that's just
Savings.
one savings, absolutely. So that's just one of many criteria, right? So again, there are no chemically pure public services, and I don't think there ever will be. There's no perfect person either, right? It'd be a very boring place if we were all like that. So, warts and all, I think that different cases, different places, depending on the politics, the hydrology, the histories, and so on, will differ from place to place. So, Paris has been very successful in many ways. But yeah, a little disappointing, I think, for water activists that the average French person really has no idea what went on.
All right, great. Was any further questions? No, well then please join me in thanking David for a fantastic talk.